Today we're going to talk about the difference in between gouache and watercolor, two very similar mediums with some very big differences. We're going to start off with watercolor. I'm painting this lobster here in watercolor, and there's a few things we need to know about watercolor. The first thing is that it's transparent. Whatever I put down now will be present in some capacity at the end of the painting. That means every mark I make will be able to be seen in the end. And so while I can paint over the top, the little bits of color will always be showing through. And so right now I'm looking at the lights, the highlights and the colors in the light in any given section, and really just focusing in on the colors that I'm seeing. One of the consequences of this is that no matter what I do, I'm not really going to get my painting to get lighter by painting over the top. So if I have a dark red here and I put a lighter color on top a little bit later, it's not really going to get lighter. It's just going to have a little bit more of that color quality to it. And this is the primary difference between watercolor and gouache. While gouache is a lot like watercolor, if I get thick enough, I can cover over what was underneath while I'm painting. This means I can fix my mistakes or else just plan a painting so that I'm intending to paint over the top like I would in perhaps oil or acrylic. So the general advice for watercolor is to go from light to dark. However, in areas like this tail back here, where things really are dark, I can go straight to that dark from the beginning. Some people will often find themselves trapped in just painting really light with watercolor, when in truth, watercolor can get really, really rich and dark and absolutely stunningly beautiful and realistic. Really, any medium you use can do almost anything. And so the visual difference you have between the mediums that you might think about quite often are stylistic or mechanical choices rather than saying something about the medium itself. But let's get back to this watercolor here. I've put down these big, rich, beautiful colors, which honestly I could have put down a little bit more rich even still. And then I'm applying a darker layer on top to push down to the value, that black and white quality that I want. Because it's quite often how light and dark things are that are going to help my visual system to see in 3 dimensions. And so I want to make sure that I can get light and dark the way that I'm intending. In this particular painting, there are no real highlights. There's nothing that's really just white. And so I've put down a color for everything. And then I'm working deeper and darker and further down. We can do this in gouache too. In fact, you can paint gouache a lot like watercolor. You can go light to dark, you can reserve your lights. You can put in your saturated colors first and then layer different colors over top. But you then have a little bit more flexibility with how you want things to turn out. Because you can paint over the top to put in details and highlights in a way that you just can't with watercolor. Again, because putting a lighter color on top of a darker color in watercolor will 99% of the time make your color a little bit darker even still. However, one of the beautiful things about watercolor is that because you're always seeing through the colors, you can come by some really, really beautiful color combinations by accident or by intention by layering on top. Right now, I want this tail to feel a little bit more purple. So I'm literally grabbing a little bit of purple and placing it over top. And what comes out is something that feels natural and like it fits in. If I'm painting with thick gouache, I have to renegotiate the color altogether in order to try and make something that feels like it fits. And so while in watercolor, we can be very experimental with our colors and run into some really beautiful combinations on accident. If we're painting thick with gouache, so that it's covering over what is below it, we don't get quite that same experiment. But we're starting off our gouache lobster with the one trick we talked about, placing down a really dark piece of paint and saying, you know what, I want that to be lighter, and then placing down lighter paint even still. And so when I'm painting with gouache, especially thick like this, We can be a little bit more haphazard, just throwing paint around, knowing that we can come back and paint over the top. This allows us to paint like we think a little bit more, rather than be enslaved to the process. But it does come at the cost of having to be really intentional about what colors are coming off of our brush, because it has a little less of that capacity to really play and accidentally find really beautiful harmonious colors together. But there's something really interesting that you can see in this, is that I've been using the same brush for watercolor and gouache. I've been using the same paper for watercolor and gouache. The two mediums really are very tightly related. So if you're wondering about what you should use materials-wise for watercolor and for gouache, the answer is the same. In fact, you can mix watercolor and gouache together using all of the same materials and get a really nice result. This gives us a lot of flexibility in how we can do this. We talked a little bit about the limitations of watercolor. Let's talk more about the limitations of gouache. One of the things that you're going to come across is that Oz gouache is thick and opaque and matte, which means it's not quite so shiny. In fact, you'll find that watercolor ends up being a little bit shinier than gouache is. But because this is the case, as it dries, it loses even more of its color saturation and value depth, how dark it goes. So some of its deep darks get a little bit lighter, some of its lights get a little bit darker. And while this quality is shared between watercolor and gouache, it's a little bit more pronounced in gouache. While this can be frustrating at first, this is something that you can, in the end, learn to predict and even compensate for, so that what you're painting turns to look very naturalistic and realistic. Every limitation of whatever medium you have, and every medium will have limitations, is something that we can work with. And so when we're putting our darks down, we want them a little extra dark. When we're putting our lights down, we want them a little extra light, and they're going to meet in the middle and create something very natural feeling. However, if you want to work with watercolor and gouache together, you can use gouache in your lights and then pull in watercolor for your deep darks, and it's going to retain a little bit more of its richness. You can also just fully create a gouache painting and add a little bit more watercolor on top of those deep darks, or any color that you feel like you're not quite reaching in gouache in order to get a little bit more of that color through. So they're entirely exchangeable. Another more mechanical difference between watercolor and gouache is that watercolor can sit in your palette for a long time and retain pretty much a good portion of its freshness. Gouache is going to dry out in your palette a lot sooner, and so if you want to keep gouache around, you have to take a little bit of time every day or so and spritz your palette with a little bit of water just to keep it fresh. Now, if you'd like to learn to paint with gouache and don't really know where to begin, I have a free online workshop called The Roadmap to Painting with Gouache, where I show you how I'd learn to paint with gouache if I were to start all over again. The link to that is in the description below, and I would love to see you there. So as we've talked about so far already, both watercolor and gouache will change a little bit when they dry. And in both cases, the more water that you use, the more that change is going to happen. So I can use watercolor in a giant wash with lots of water, and it's going to go from being a rich, vibrant color to being a really light pastel color. And the same thing is true with gouache. The more water that you use, the more that the paint is going to change as it dries. For both of them, this means that if we want to pick up a piece of color from our palette and put it down and have it stay close to where we put it in terms of its color and how light and how dark it is, we want a really good thick piece of paint that's not going to have very much water in it. And when we do want to use a good bit of water, we have to be prepared for the fact that it's going to change. And what you're going to find for mastering both of these mediums is that learning to understand what happens when you place different amounts of water into the paint and use them is really almost our number one thing that we want to focus on. And then both mediums will start to make a lot of sense. When we're painting with gouache, if we grab a lot of paint, as we start to put more paint into our mix, as opposed to more water, we're going to get to a point where the color doesn't get any darker. This is what we call opacity. The color that we see is the color that we put down. And while it might change a little bit after it dries, this part of mixing color becomes a little bit easier for gouache. And this is because the color in our paint wells are opaque at this point. However, with watercolor, when we reach a lot of our watercolor paint, instead of staying the same color because it's opaque, it rapidly gets darker, almost like it's multiplying how dark it is. And so a lot of the colors in our paint wells are going to be a little bit harder to see precisely what color they are until we start to add more water to them. And so this is a part of painting with watercolor that's just a little bit harder. And finally, the surface quality of both paints is a little bit different. This is really one of their big defining features. Our watercolor, being more transparent, has a little bit more of a jewel-like quality, a little bit of shine to it. Our gouache, because it's matte and opaque, has a very velvety finish to it. But as mediums, they are very similar. And in fact, if you're a watercolor artist, I recommend go out and try gouache. It's going to teach you a lot about watercolor. And if you're a gouache artist, go ahead and look at watercolor. It's going to teach you a lot about being a gouache artist.